Well, hey, everybody, it's so good to be online with you today. We're in a series called Divested, and for the past several weeks, first week I shared, and then the second week, one of our overseers, David Payne, shared. And if you were with us uniquely online, you saw an online message that was a little bit different than what we had in person. This is one of the seasons where there's a definite difference in the texture of the experience. And I do want to encourage you, get back into church if you haven't done that yet. Get around some believers. Get face to face with people. Now today, as we continue in this series, another speaker we're excited to have with us is Eric Parton. Eric serves as a church planner and lead pastor at Shoreline Church in Destin, Florida. Over 20 years ago, Eric and his wife, Darlene, planted one of the most creative churches in the country. I mean, this church takes church and takes it outside the walls of the church, and they take it to people. They meet them right where they're at. If you've ever been in Destin, Florida, and been to Crab Island, which is just a giant swimming pool, it's an area where the water's only about 2 or 3 feet deep, and people park their boats out there. They figured out a way to take church out to Crab Island, and it's just been such an amazing thing to build this relationship that we have with the Partons. And I would say Eric is not just an overseer. He does work in there. He's kind of like a spiritual, how do I put it? A spiritual big brother. That's who he is. He's the guy I go to when I have questions, and he's the guy that I call when, hey, this didn't go right and I need some insight, or I'm struggling with this, or I'm mad about this. Can you talk to me? Can you walk me through it? He's been a constant source of encouragement. He's been somebody who, even for my family, they've welcomed us as a family into their home multiple times. I got to go down and speak at their church this past year. Love them, love their staff. I love their hearts. Eric loves our family, especially our kids, so well. I've watched him pray over my kids, just tears streaming down his face. You know, he's the real deal. I don't know how else to put it. And today, we're going to share a message with you online from Eric. And this is going to be a message that he preached at their church in Shoreline. And, you know, if you were in person with us today, you'd probably get to see a little different message. And, you know, I'm so thankful that we can have a venue like this online to share that message, to really invite you into a space where you can hear from somebody that has that kind of influence in our lives. So right now, I want you to lock in. I want you to get ready. I want you to get ready to really just open up your heart to receive from one of our overseers, one of my friends, Pastor Eric Parton.
I can see clearly now, the rain is gone. I can see all the obstacles in the way. Gone all the dark clouds that had me blind. It's gonna be a bright, sunshiny day. It's gonna be a bright, sunshiny day.
Good morning. My name is Eric. I'm the lead pastor here at Shoreline. Just want to thank you for being here, especially if you're watching online or watching from Crab Island. As Darlene said, how many were here last week for Pastor Darlene? Didn't she do a great job? So I've been gone for 2 weeks, and I was camping, and I called to Darlene and 2 of my closest friends to let them know about something incredibly holy and powerful and that happened to me. So imagine my surprise when last Sunday I'm driving down I-80 in Wyoming watching the service, and Darlene shares that holy moment with all of you guys. So now I have to talk about it, right? So I went camping for 2 weeks. It was actually 2 trips. The second trip, I'll just tell you first, was I led a group of pastors into, we had 3 cowboys with us. It was a packed trip. We were on horses. We did 5 days in Yellowstone National Park. And what we do is we lead pastors in, and then we sit around the campfire. And because a lot of pastors are hurting out there and they don't have friends, and many are thinking about quitting. And so we used that time to reach pastors. It was a tough camping trip. It rained for 2 days. The mosquitoes were way worse than Florida. But it was good. It was good. I did see when we were, so we were going down the trail, and I'm on a horse, so I'm pretty high up, and in the tree next to the trail is a claw mark of a grizzly. And I'm telling you, the paw was this wide, just down the tree. And it's higher than me. Like, I could touch it. I'm on the horse and going, I hope we don't meet that guy. So it was amazing, though. We sat around the fire every night, and I asked questions. And we actually let the cowboys, because sometimes the cowboys, they'll have other things to do, but they stayed around the fire. And the lead cowboy, his daddy was a Pentecostal preacher who died when he was 8 from Alabama. And he kind of got in trouble after that, walked away from the church, was very hurt, and ended up praying and giving his heart back to the Lord there around the campfire. So that was very powerful. But what Darlene is talking about, what I did was I went out early, and I like to camp by myself. Now, I've camped a couple of times by myself before. I did 2 days in the Everglades National Park. And when I say in the Everglades, I'm not talking about a campground. I'm talking backcountry camping. And then this year I did by myself, but I was with my dog at Talladega National Forest. I did a night there. But so I did 6 nights camping by myself. And some people ask me, they go, isn't it kind of scary or sketchy? Because I'm camping on public lands. Out west, you have Black Lives Matter, BLM, Bureau of Land Management. Because that's what people say. They go, anyway, back east, people don't know what the BLM land is. Bureau of Land Management. You got forestry land. It's all public lands. Utah is 75% public lands. Wyoming is the same thing. So you can just camp anywhere you want. So it's public lands. So you're camping on public lands. So it can be a bit, I guess the word I have to say is a bit not relaxing. Because, you're sitting around a campfire, but you're kind of aware. What was that? You hear a noise. Is that something? So it's not very relaxing. And I try to be ready for what can happen. Darlene said I carry a sidearm with me. I carry it holstered right here. So when I'm setting up camp, if somebody walks into camp that night or when I'm setting up, I want them to see that I'm armed and they can see it and I can easily access it. That didn't happen. Let me kind of explain. The first couple nights, the campsites were not the best. Sometimes we get some epic sites because what you do is I'm following this route called the Backcountry Discovery Route. They have them in all the states out west, and they basically try to make it as much off-road as possible where you go from one end of the state to the other. So I was on this backcountry route that started in Baggs, Wyoming, and ends up in the Bighorn Mountains up in Montana. And the way they kind of set it up is you're on trails that go through national forest land, and maybe you run 100 miles, 150 miles, and then you go into a town, so you have to go back off the road, and then you usually resupply, get gas, and then you drive out of town and get on the next trail. So if you time it perfect, you're looking for a campground while you're in the forest. Well, the first night, I'm in Rifle, Colorado, which is right on I-70. And I'm trying to find a camp spot. So I end up camping up this hill outside of town so people can see me up there. And I don't really like that, but it takes 4-wheel drive to get up there, so I felt a little safe about that. But I didn't have a fire because people could see me if I was up there. I just kept the lights down to a minimum. I can look down on the city. Most of the time, I'm camping out in the forest and nobody's around. So the first night wasn't an epic sight. I didn't have a fire. I just sat there and I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. Because normally how many associate camping with a fire, right? If you can't have a fire, why camp? So this is the first time that I just sat there in the dark. The next night, I found a campsite late as well because I couldn't find anything protected because I was in a desert. And it ended up being so windy, I couldn't even set up a tent. I had to sleep in the back seat of the truck. So it wasn't until the 3rd or 4th night, I ended up with a site on the Encampment River, which is right outside Encampment, Wyoming. And it was so good, I stayed there for 2 nights. And that's where I had an incredible breakthrough because I was able to just sit there. And I remember on the 3rd night, it kind of rained, so I just sat in my tent. But the 4th night, I was able to sit by the fire, and I had this peace that I didn't have before. And I was able to just sit there by the fire for 2 hours. Now, this is That's amazing for me because I'm an extrovert. I like people. I like noise. I like to fall asleep to the TV. I don't do it. We don't have a TV in our room, but I would do it. I like to have noise. So for me to be camping for 6 days by myself, sitting around the fire at night, that was just, because if I'm in a conversation, I hate awkward silence. Like that. Now, see, I don't mind that anymore. I'll probably do that a lot. No, but I hate silence. But for that fourth night, it was almost like I had a breakthrough where I did have a breakthrough. I just got this peace. I'm sitting around the fire. For 2 hours, I sat there and I even turned my chair away from the fire just so I could look at the stars. And God did something in me. Because now I valued that quiet. And I realized it's something that I need to pursue on a regular basis. So that kind of started a breakthrough where I wasn't sketchy. I wasn't like, oh, what's that noise? I would just build the fire and I'd just sit there at night. And on the last night, I was sitting there and I was extremely grateful. I was extremely maybe humbled because of what's happened in the last 3 years. If some of you know my story, in the last 3 years, we've lived in 6 different locations. We moved 5 different times in the last 3 years. One of them was in the parking lot right here in the church in an RV because we kind of were homeless for a little while. And in that time, I was upset. I was upset with God. I was mad. I blamed people. I blamed the HOA. I blamed the banks, the banking industry, the real estate industry. I blamed the city council. I blamed everybody and everything. And I wasn't living by faith either. Through that whole 3 years, I'm supposed to be the pastor. I'm supposed to be, because people would say something like, oh, well, God obviously has something better for you. And I'm like, I know you mean well, but I live in the parking lot of the church, okay? And I used to have a house on the water. And then I'd sing a song like, even when I don't see it, your work. And I go, okay, God, you're right. I need to live by faith. And then the next thing out of my mouth would be like, God, why? Why has this happened? Even my own realtor said to me, Eric, you're supposed to be the pastor. Yeah, that's not faith. Why are you talking like that? You know what I'd say to her? Shut up, Michelle, because anyway, so we went through this whole thing. And then 3 years later, this April, we end up in a house that we absolutely love that has water access. I don't know how God did it. I do looking back, but I didn't have the faith to believe it. I wasn't going around, I just believe that God has something better. I look back and I was actually kind of embarrassed. I was embarrassed that I behaved and I acted this way and I doubted God. And as your pastor, I'm supposed to be setting an example and I was just embarrassed. So here I am on this trip in some of the most remote, beautiful parts of the country. And I'm just sitting there at a fire and I'm just enjoying God. And I'm kind of having this conversation with him back and forth. Most of it was just like, God, I'm not worthy. But in spite of all the negativity, that God still blessed me. And here I am sitting, not only do we have a beautiful home now, but I'm sitting in one of those beautiful places, and I'm expressing this on this last night, and as Darlene told you last week, what happened was I'm sitting there expressing I have no lights on, just the fire right by my tent, and I'm there, and I'm just talking to God, and I hear voices. So I get up and I have my firearm and I walk around the campsite. I actually kind of go up this hill to see if I see anything or see anybody. Where I'm camped, it would have to have a really technical, high clearance 4-wheel drive to get to. So I'm surprised that there's anybody out there, and there was nobody out there. I went back and sat by the fire, and it kind of happened again. And I realized the conversation, because I've been so quiet for 6 days by myself, that the conversation that was happening with God inside my head sounded like it was outside. I'm not saying I heard God's voice audible. What I'm saying is I couldn't tell the difference of being inside my head and sounding like it was out loud. Now, I was telling one of my pastor friends about this because honestly, I look back at the last 3 years, I'll just be honest with you. That's good for a pastor to say. I'm 60 years old. I'm looking towards transitioning my position out of this church. And I'm thinking, I'm just going to take it easy. I would, in that issue with God, in that whole time where we don't have a home, I'm thinking, God, why is this happening to me now? I'm 60 years old. I should be living off the equity that we've built in our homes. And now I'm homeless. And honestly, looking back, I was thinking that I'm past those tests. These are the things that happen when you're a young pastor, when you're just starting the church, when you're just starting your family. I'm like, yeah, I'm an idiot because God wants to, because I don't think we ever arrive, right? So I'm sitting there. In fact, I asked a pastor friend of mine, I talking to a pastor friend of mine, and he goes, well, what did God speak to you? I'm like, well, he didn't tell me to build an ark. It wasn't anything like that. And what it the only way I can relate it to, I felt like doubting Thomas, right? I felt like I doubted God, that in this, I'm throwing fits and he's behind the scenes working even when I don't see it to bless me. I felt like Peter, if you remember the story where Jesus rose from the dead and Peter and them went fishing, then he calls Peter back to the beach and he has breakfast with him and he says, Peter, do you love me? He says, yes, I do. Then tend my sheep. And he did it 3 times, just same amount of times that Peter denied him 3 times. Basically kind of restored him and who he was. I felt like that's what God was doing with me. He got me out there and said, God, I know it's been rough for you, Eric, but I've been here the whole time. And I really felt like what the word that he used was unearnable grace. Yeah, I didn't have faith. I didn't believe God all the time. I had a lot of negative things, but you know what, Eric? I love you so much that what I'm doing for you, you can't earn anyway. And it did something for me. It did something inside of me. I almost felt like it was preparing me for the next season, which we're going to hear about some more in this series. But looking back, I didn't feel like a great example to you guys. I felt like, I just blamed everybody and everything. So this trip kind of recentered me. I wasn't really going to talk about it because you talk about that, you sound weird or you sound mushy. And words don't even describe. When I try to tell you, oh yeah, I heard God audibly, you're either a nut job or, words don't describe what really happened. So I didn't really want to share it, but thanks to Darlene, she already shared it. I had to, right? But I think that God recentered my relationship with him as we move into the next season. And maybe you can relate to this. I'm sure you've been there where, you feel like something happens to you and you just, the first thing out of your mouth is, this always happens to me. Why does this always happen to me? I feel, I finally get ahead and then something happens and I'm 2 steps back. And if that's you, I hope you're encouraged by my story, and I hope you're going to be encouraged by the story that we're going to look at today in the Bible. And I want you to know that if that is you, God, what I've learned is God's not upset with you. In fact, it really is part of the process that we go through on our journey of faith with him, of understanding what's really inside us and understanding that God is unconditionally on our side. So today what I want to do is we continue our series, I can see clearly now. I'm going to bounce off of what Darlene talked about last week in the book of Nehemiah. And my goal today is that, like my journey out west camping I think I camped 11 days out of 15. So my goal is that you have clarity at the end of this journey, at the end of this trip we're taking through Nehemiah, that more clarity than we started off with, okay? So what we're gonna do is, to kick it off, I wanna do something different than we normally do at Shoreline. I wanna read from the Bible. I don't mean that way. We always read from the Bible. I'm gonna read a whole chapter. That's what some of you are like, what do you normally use? The People magazine? Yeah, we normally read out a People magazine. No, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read a chapter of Nehemiah. And so if this is the first time you've been to church, or maybe like John Henry says, school starting, we find a lot of people come back to church because they're kind of, hey, let's get a new rhythm going and let's include church in that rhythm. Let's get our kids in church. If that's you, that's great. In fact, you may be already like, this guy's talking about God, talk to him. You don't have to believe what we believe to come here. But we're glad that you're here, especially if you're watching online. Or maybe someone dragged you, whatever it is, maybe first time in a long time or first time in church at all. I believe that this is a pretty good service for you to be back, but I do want to be honest with you. I am going to talk a little bit about money today. So don't let it distract you from really the overarching idea and theme of this book that we're going to look at, because this chapter we're going to read and this book that we're going to read, Nehemiah, is not like an ordinary book. For one, it's not a Bible story, because a lot of times we look at Bible stories and go, oh yeah, he was swallowed by a whale and then the whale spit him out, or they parted the Red Sea, and we go, oh, those are Bible stories. Like that would never happen today. No, this is a story about a man who did something incredibly, extraordinarily incredible, that the Jewish people valued what he did so much that they included it in their scripture. And then when the Bible was being written, that portion of scripture was included in what we call the Old Testament of the Bible. And the story is so extraordinary because what we're gonna find, what makes it not a Bible story, is that there's not a miracle in this story. You don't see God performing a miracle. What you find in the book of Nehemiah is a story about hard work, about hope, about discipline, and especially about vision. In fact, I was looking at this story and I thought this would be a story that Mel Gibson would write about, that do a movie about. Because you know how he does a movie about true heroic characters, they can take our wives, they can take our land. Is it our wives? Or they could, because some of those Scottish guys were like, oh, I didn't know they could take our wives. Well, sure, go ahead, take that. Anyway, take my wives, please. Anyway. No, it's one of those stories that you follow because it's such a man of character and bravery and courage. And so what I want to do is I want to read the first chapter, the entire chapter of this ancient document called Nehemiah, which takes place after what is known as the Jewish exile. A little history lesson for you. Around 605 BC, the Babylonians invaded Judah. We got a map of modern day Israel. If you look at this map, at the top is what you would call, would be what they would call Israel. And down by Jerusalem, the southern part was known as Judah because they'd had a civil war and they split into two different sections, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Babylon took over Israel, and then a couple years later, they invaded Jerusalem and took over Judah. And so they invaded Judah, and if you remember the story, anybody remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? The 3 Hebrew children thrown into the fiery furnace, that was King Nebuchadnezzar. That's during this time, all right? So they invade Israel, or they invade Judah, and about 70 years go by, and Israel, Jerusalem is basically shut down. It's run down, okay, been conquered by the Babylonians. But during that time, Persia conquers Babylon. So now Persia, Babylon's taken all these Israelites, these Jewish people captive. Now Persia takes them over. And so the king of Persia, his name's Cyrus, he's the leader of Persia, and he thinks, we sure have a lot of Jewish people around here. And so he makes a proclamation, says, hey, if you were taken captive by the Babylonians, if you want to go back home, you have our permission, you can go back to Israel. So Jewish people begin to migrate back to Judah. And so over time, there's hundreds of thousands of Jewish people heading back to Jerusalem, and they're trying to get the economy going again and get the temple going again and things like that, but it wasn't going well. For one, they'd been gone for so long. I mean, everything was broken down. And two, when they were conquered, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered them, what he would do when he would conquer a city, he would find the best, the wisest, most educated people, and he would bring them back as slaves to Babylon, where they would serve in some capacity. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing. They were serving in a capacity as leaders or servants or whatever. And so they only left the worst, the guys wearing wife beaters who were on cop shows, that's who's left back there. Secondly, the other thing that was going on is that they'd been gone so long that when the Jewish people are moving back, other people had moved in. And now these Jewish people are coming back by the thousands, and they're like, hey, you can't just come back here and say this was your land. So this has gone on, so it's about 90 years after the exile, and that's where we meet Nehemiah, and we're not even sure if Nehemiah had ever even been to Jerusalem or Israel or Judah. We're pretty sure that he was born in Babylon as a servant, but because of his Jewish heritage, Jerusalem was always on his mind. We do know, however, that he was a servant to King Artaxerxes, who was the king of Persia. So Nehemiah begins to journal his story, and that's what this is. The book of Nehemiah is a journal about what happened. And so what I want to do is read the first chapter, and I'm going to challenge us as a church. And if this isn't your church, if you're watching online or whatever, or you're just here on vacation, you're off the hook. But the rest of us, we're on the hook, and we're going to answer this question that we're going to look at, and we're going to talk about this for the rest of the month. So you ready? Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. Here's how it starts out, very beginning. It says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. Now, last week, how many were here last week for Darlene? And she butchered these Jewish names, right? Let me give you the key to pronouncing Jewish is you got to get your mouth full of phlegm and go, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. That's how the Jewish people say it. Or you can do it Southern and just say, Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the city or the citadel of Susa. So this is history. In other words, you can look this up, all right? Susa was essentially the capital of Persia. They didn't have capitals back then, but that was where the king lived, okay? Verse 2. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah. So he was one of the guys that had gone back, right? And now he'd come back to this area in Persia. So he came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant. The remnant these are the people that were in exile and they had gone back. That's what they called them, was the remnant, all right? And so all these families had been displaced and now they're beginning to move back in that direction. So I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So basically, people had come back from Jerusalem and Nehemiah's like, how's it going? Are we a city yet? What's going on? And this is what they said. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned by fire. So basically they're saying, no, things are not good. A lot of people are back. A lot of people are on their way, but it's not good. We got no walls for protection. We got no gates for protection. Our pets' heads are falling off. So, the people around us, they don't want us there. So no, it's not good. Now the next statement is very powerful. Verse 4, he says, when I heard these things, he says, I sat down and wept. See, for Nehemiah, this wasn't just news. It wasn't like, oh, wow, that's a bummer. Sorry to hear that. I'll pray for you. Be blessed and be filled. I really can't do anything because, I live in Susa. I work for the most powerful man in the world. I got a job. I got a family. I can't just pack up and go. Here, let me write you a check. Because I can't do anything else, right? See, that wasn't his response. When Nehemiah found out, it broke his heart. And he wept over Jerusalem. And it continues, he says, for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, and then he journals his prayer, okay? For what he prays this prayer and he tells us what it is. I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love. Remember what a covenant is? Nehemiah is reminding God of the promises that he'd made with Israel. Okay, God, you remember your promises, right? And he uses the word covenant because that's what God did. He cut a covenant. He says, if you'll do this, I'll do that, right? He says, God, awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keeps his commandments. Because back in the Old Testament, God had set up a kind of conditional agreement with Israel. Went something like this. Here's my laws. Here's my rules. You keep them. You get to stay in the land. But if you break my laws and abandon me, in other words, you're no longer a light to the world, then I'm going to allow your land to be taken from you. And you'll be taken captive by nations. So he's reminding God of that. He says then again in verse 6, he says, let your ears be attentive and your eyes be open to the prayer your servant, that's me, is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. And then he does something very interesting. Look what he does next. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself, look at this, and my father's family. See, we often don't hear that. Lots of times we'll hear, hey, I can't be responsible for what happened 100 years before me. That was my grandfather who was a racist. That wasn't me. I know it's not politically correct to talk about that in a place like this, but he says, I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We've acted very wickedly toward you. In other words, we deserve to be thrown out of our land. The way we treated you, we broke the agreement that you made with us. I get it why you allowed us. What our forefathers did a long time ago, we deserved it. He says, we have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Then I love it. He goes, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses? Can you remember talking to God like that? Remember what you said to Moses? Yeah, I remember that. I am God, right? And he says it. He goes, this is what God had told Moses. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. What is that? Jerusalem. Because there was something about Jerusalem. There's still something about Jerusalem. Think about this. He said this to Moses 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and yet we've seen multiple times where the Jewish people have been taken out of their land and then brought back. Because there's something about Jerusalem. There's something about Jerusalem today that, that's where the temple is. That's where they believed the presence of God was. And then verse 10, he says, they are your servants and your people whom you redeemed. He's talking about the ones that came out of Egypt by your great strength and your mighty hand. In other words, God, you remember the whole Moses and Egypt thing. You remember the plagues. You remember the let my people go. You went to great trouble to redeem your people out of slavery from Egypt, and when they were scattered all over the place, and now they're scattered all over the place again. Would you be willing, because we repent for breaking your commands. I understand our forefathers did, but would you be willing to do it again? And then he prays this prayer. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of what he's about to do. Now, obviously, Darlene talked about this last week. Nehemiah has a great job. He's a cupbearer to the king. That means you bring in, you're basically a waiter. You bring in and you serve the king wine. You're actually supposed to taste it first to make sure if it's not poison. So, one time it's poison, you're out of a job because you're out of your life anyway. But it's a great job. He works for the most powerful man on the planet. And what we're going to find out, what Darlene talked about last week, is and if you're going to read Nehemiah, he's about to go into the king and say, King, I need an indefinite leave of absence. I want a leave of absence so I can go back to my homeland and rebuild the city so that we can become a country again. I mean, that's just wrong on so many levels. For one, why would I want you to rebuild a city that, we or the Babylonians conquered? Now we want you to become powerful again? No way. And secondly, you don't go in and ask the king for favors. The king asks you for favors. In fact, you don't even talk to the king unless he asks you a question, which, spoiler alert, read chapter 2, he does ask Nehemiah a question. But the thing is, he was moved his heart was so broken for the condition of Jerusalem that he felt compelled. He had to do something. He had to act on what he heard. And then I love this last sentence. This is how the chapter ends. It says, and I was a cupbearer to the king. So read the chapter. Let me ask you a question. This is the question I want to answer, not today. I don't expect an answer today, but hopefully by the end of this series, we'll have an answer to this. And actually, I really wanted to kind of drive us all the time. This is one of those questions like, what would Jesus do? It's not something that you just do for 6 weeks. It's something that should drive you and compel you. And the question is this, what are we willing to do for the cause of Christ? What are we willing to do when it comes to the cause of Christ? When we look around our community, when you look around your neighborhood, your city, your country, when you look at the state of our economy, the state of politics, when you look at the school systems, or you look at what's happening with kids and teenagers and young adults, or what's happening with the world, what's happening in the horrible college football playoff system, what captures your emotions? What breaks your heart? In other words, what is it that you look at that when you see, you can't get it off your mind? You just can't get away from it. You can't stop thinking about it. In fact, you try not to think about it, because when you think about it, you're like, I don't know, I don't want to think about this because I'm just too busy. I don't have the resources. I don't have the time. I live too far away. There's nothing I can do about it. So I don't want to think about it, because if I think about it, it just drives me crazy. So I just rather not look at it. I'd rather not think about it because there's nothing I can do about it. What is that? What is there that breaks your heart? And see, that's a dangerous question. In fact, instead of saying, because we look at these things and we go, someone should do something about that. But what if instead of saying someone should do something about it, what if we ask the question, what can I do about it? Because the truth is, if we really want to make the world a better place, I want to bounce off what Darlene said, then we have to start with what's in front of us. There's an old Latin proverb that says, anybody had to take Latin? O fili me boni belli, for nabisco selleth all his dominos. Yeah. What man is, that's not really Latin, by the way. That's Cheech and Chong. What man is a man who does not leave the world a better place, right? Who doesn't want to leave the world a better place? Now, when we started this church 17 years ago, this book was super impacting and super influential on us. It inspired us because what you're seeing from Nehemiah, and if I encourage you to read this book, what you see, this is vision. You know, when you get into business and you start a business, you start a church, you go to conferences, everyone loves to talk about vision. And a lot of times vision is presented as, hey, here's where we're going. But from what I learned about vision, and this is what inspired us, from Nehemiah, what vision is seeing how things are and how they should or could be. That's what vision is. Vision is, this is the state of our economy. This is the state of politics. This is what's happening with our teenagers, but this is how it should be. And that's what Nehemiah was facing, and that's where he got his vision. This is what Jerusalem looks like now. It's broken down, it's burned by fire, it's defenseless, but this is what it should be, a powerful city of God. See, that was Nehemiah's vision. It wasn't just to go back to Jerusalem, it was to do something that this is how it looks now, but this is how it should be. And so everything that he did lines up with that vision. And so years ago when we were starting Shoreline, many of you know this, one of the things that we looked at was how people perceived God. That much of the perception that people had of God was wrong. Now I know that sounds pretentious to say your perception of God was wrong, but when you compare what people would say about God to what Jesus said about God, they didn't match up. Jesus would say things like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And he would tell a story about a father that's waiting for a son that took all his money and blew it on harlots and partying and then comes back waiting. He says, this is what your heavenly Father's like. He doesn't condemn you or blame you, which is some of the perception that people have. If I walk into church, God's gonna strike me down. No, the perception that Jesus painted was there's a father that's standing on a hill looking far away for you when you're far off to welcome you home. And the perceptions weren't matching up. The perceptions that people had of God that were not matching up to the perception that Jesus portrayed. And so our vision was like, what if we changed the perception of God? That's what we need to do, because the perception is this, and this is what it really should be. So that kind of inspired our vision. But we had to get through the perception of church. Because people have perceptions of church in modern America is that it's too judgmental, it's homophobic, it's too political, they just want your money, they're hypocrites. We had to change that. So what we had to do, that was kind of what drove us, is said, listen, what if we can change the perception of church, which was extremely difficult because much of the perception of God was driven by the church. Much of the perception that people have of God is driven by the church because they have those perceptions. So in order, that became our vision. Let's change the perception of what church should be like so that we could ultimately change the perception of God. So this book really inspired us. Now, here's something I know about you because I know this about me. The people that inspire you, the people that you read their biographies, the people that you talk to your children about, the people that you watch, whatever, the people that inspire you, the people you look up to, they're not people that are like in shape or able to, maintain their ideal weight. I mean, we hate those people anyway. It's not people that they're able to get out of debt. Oh my God, he was in $12,000 in credit card debt and he got out of 1 year. I want to be just like him. Don't get me wrong, that's good. I mean, some of y'all need to get out of debt. Some of y'all need to, get in shape. A lot of y'all need to lose weight. I'm preaching to myself, okay, right? But that's not what inspires you. You know what inspires you? What inspires me is people who make a difference in the world, who make a better place in the world, people who make someone else's world a better place. That's what inspires you. And here's the thing. Every one of us here, because of the vision that God has given this church, we have the opportunity to change the world, especially as we're gonna find out, and like Darlene talked about, when we do it together. We have the potential to change our little slice of the pie. We have the potential to change someone else's world. Now, here's what else I know about us. Because I know this about me. That if I don't take this perspective, we don't take this perspective, let me tell you what the rest of the year will look like. And I can tell you what 2023 will look like, especially going into these midterm elections. You know what we'll do? We'll sit around, we'll watch the news, and we'll read the news, and we'll watch TV, and we'll begin to blame. And we'll do just like I did, and we'll begin to blame everybody and everything. But here's what you need to know. Blaming, people who blame things don't change things. You can tweet this. This is good. Think about this. People who blame things, if that's all you do, those people don't change things. And it'll always be, because here's what happens is we see something that breaks our heart emotionally or makes us mad and says it shouldn't be this way, and something happens inside us and our defense mechanisms kick in and we say something like, somebody needs to do something about us. And ultimately at the end, we'll begin to blame, and it'll be the president's fault or Congress' fault or the PTA's fault or the city council's fault or the IRS or the preacher's fault or the HOA's fault. Probably is the HOA's fault. We can go ahead and blame them, but the rest of them. And we'll sit around and watch TV and we'll watch the stupid news and we'll blame everyone and everything. But what if we took all that time and energy that we use to blame people, and instead of blaming for somebody or something for the things that we don't like, what if we used it to focus and change what we don't like? Because as long as we're blaming, nothing is changing. Listen, blaming is not a strategy for anything. All blaming does is when you blame, you just avoid changing things. So what if we took all the energy that we use for blaming things and focused it on the area in front of us and said, I may not be able to change the world, but I can change this world. We can make a difference in this world. We can change this little slice of our pie. Now, what does this mean for us as a church? Because it is a vision series. So this is what we talk about. We're moving into a new season. School started, summer's over. Before I get into it, let me say this. During the series, spoiler alert, I talked about how the church is not a building. Remember that? The church is a movement. You know, this building isn't holy. It was a nightclub. Some of you are like, hell no, this building isn't holy. You should see what happened in this place. No, you know, the building is holy now, but you know why? Because you're in it. Because the Bible says that he made him who knew no sin talking about Jesus, become sin for us so that we might become the right standing, the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. In other words, he traded his right standing with God with us. So because if you've received what Christ did on the cross, you are now right before God. When you come in here, we come in here as a group, this building is holy and set aside. But the church is not the building, the church is you. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have a building. A building is a tool to accomplish what God has called us to accomplish. And we believe that this building helps us accomplish that vision or that mission of changing people's perception of church. Now, earlier in the spring, hey, Dom, I love you, man. I mentioned this only one time, only 1 week. So if you weren't here that week, you missed it. So some of you might not have heard this, but one morning I came into the living room after showering and praying, and sometimes I do that together. There's a visual that you need to see. We're all gonna stand naked before God anyway, so I'm just doing it now. So, and I told Darlene when I walked in, I was like, Darlene, I think God wants us to step out in faith this year and endeavor to pay off the building. I don't want that. Because again, I've told you I'm towards the end of my career. I don't want to do another building campaign. I want to leave that to Graham. You know, I want to just coast on in. And when it's time to raise money, Graham's got to do it. I'm tired of doing that. And I told Darlene that. I said, I think God's speaking to me about paying off the building. You know what she said? I think he's speaking to me the same thing. I was like, dang it, I was hoping I was crazy. So anyway, like Nehemiah, this isn't something I can do by myself. This isn't something anybody can do by themselves. Now, if you think you can, I'd be glad to entertain it. Come talk to me after the service. You think you can pay off I could do it by myself. Okay, we'd be glad to entertain that thought. But what we're gonna find out when you read the book of Nehemiah, again, another spoiler alert, as Darlene said last week, he goes in and gets permission to go to Jerusalem. And not only does he get permission, he gets like supplies, he gets army, military people to accompany him, and they go and they rebuild the walls. And as I said before, there were no miracles. All it was people who were inspired by a vision of what it looks like and what is possible. I mean, this is Braveheart stuff, this Nehemiah. He's saying, this is what it looks like and this is what's possible. And everyone went, yeah! And they did their part. As Darlene said last week, they just took the section of wall that was in front of them, and for some it was big and for some it was huge. They did what they could do. And you know what happened? They built the walls in 52 days. I've been to Jerusalem. It is exactly 3.1 miles around the old city of Jerusalem. Our government takes almost 4 years to widen Highway 98. They built the walls in 52 days, and they didn't have modern equipment or unions. But anyway, everyone just did their part. As Darlene said, it happened because everyone just said, this is the section that I can do. And I believe it's the same for us to pay off this building. And there's a couple reasons why I believe that we need to do this. Number one, it's so stinking hot in here. Now, we got an air conditioner coming. No, that's not it. No, for one, a couple things. Number one, it will give us freedom. And the reason why it will give us freedom is because it gives us margin. And freedom is margin. When you have freedom, when you have margin, you have freedom. When you have freedom in your finances and your time, like yesterday, my sister's visiting, she had her grandchildren, we went out in the boat, and we were gonna stay out till 4 o'clock because I had a wedding, but we decided to go in early. And on the way in, there was a boat that was broken down. And because I had margin, I could go help them. Now, when I was on my way to the wedding, I'm going down Highway 98 right by the Matterhorn, and there's a tourist stuck in the sand, and he sees me in a Jeep, and he's doing like this, but I have no margin. I have to be at the wedding, so I drove by him like this, right? Because that's what margin does. Margin gives you freedom. Now, here's why this is important. That means that when we have this margin as a church, we can be even more generous. I think we're a generous church. So we could be, when generosity, listen, I wanna help you here. When generosity is what your motivation is, what happens is God ends up partnering with you because he knows he can trust you with worldly riches. Because if you're like, God, I just wanna bless people, he goes, he's looking for people to bless that wanna bless others. And listen, when you have to say, I wanna be at that place where when it's time to help someone, money is not the reason I say no. Because if money is the reason why I say no, then I'm not in a place yet where I have freedom from money. In other words, Jesus said you're gonna serve 2 masters. And when the reason you can't help somebody is because you're strapped financially, it may be because you're in debt and money has become your master. Sorry, I don't mean to step in on their feet. Here's the other reason why I believe it'd be important for us to pay off this building. As I work towards my ministry career winding down, and I'm not going anywhere. My kids hate it when I talk about this. This is what I want when I die. And they're like, Dad, don't talk about this. But you know, a wise person is planning for the future even when they're not there, right? I wanna make sure that not only do we leave the church to this next generation of leaders better than we found it, which will be easy since we started it, right? I wanna go even further and set this next generation of leaders who are gonna lead this church long after I'm gone. I wanna set them up as best as I can. Now, I know there's this kind of mindset right now with this next generation. Oh, they're entitled. They don't have any skin in the game. You're just gonna leave them everything. There's no debt. They didn't work for it. You know what? They're accountable to God for that, not me. You know what I'm accountable for? How I left this to them.